Yeah, so I think, yeah, that's a really interesting argument, and of course, we're talking when we're talking about physiology in our discussion today, we're having fatty acid exposures, and we're talking about some sort of outcome, and that could be inflammation, it could be heart disease, whatever. So obviously there's a relationship between the dietary exposure and the outcome, and that relationship hardly ever will be linear, right? You know,
Mhm.
uh, that would be probably that wouldn't be compatible with a sort of a resilient biological system. So there are different types of relationships, and people have suggested U-shaped relationships for some uh, fat exposures and different outcomes. And I think it's very hard now to find people, particularly, I guess, in the US, with very low intakes of linoleic acid. Um, and I mean, you might argue most of the population has a too high intake of linoleic acid for some of the reasons we've touched on. And what's interesting, so the average intake of linoleic acid in the US in men is about adult men is about 17 grams per day, which is really high. So in the UK, the average intake in adults is something like 12 grams per day. So, the average intake in the US is about 50% more than in the UK. So actually, you could do like an ecological study where you got intakes from multiple populations and tried to put together this hypothetical curve, because there will be populations with quite low intakes of linoleic acid as well. Um, but there are all of the interactions that we have to think about. We talked about what's the total energy intake, but what's the
Mhm.
total fat intake? What's the intake of omega threes? So it's tricky. But yeah, so I think you're saying we might be in a spot where decreasing intake sufficiently, we could get to a place where there's even better outcome. It's just we're looking in the wrong bit of the relationship. So I mean that is an argument, but that would require a massive dietary change, I think. And I
Mhm.
think, if I'm honest, I think that would be probably impossible to do in settings where linoleic acid has already become so common in the diet.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's kind of well, with any solution I find in in modern times, it's like when we can kind of advance versus retract, it tends to be a better option because for one, it's like let's say we just decided, okay, well, yeah, these linoleic acid rich seed oils are problematic. We're going to remove them from the food supply.
Mm.
Well, what are you gonna replace them with? And
Yeah,
what is that gonna do to the
yeah,
price point of food and the stability of food and everything that goes into that? Because it's like I mean, I see this argument all the time, it's like, "Why not just eat olive oil?" Like, it's
yeah,
an easy choice. It's like,
yeah, sure.
"Well, yeah, it's an easy choice for me because I got a ton of options." But that's not
Yeah, yeah.
necessarily an easy choice for everybody else. So I try to think of it from that lens where it's like, is it gonna be easier for us to say, like, kinda what we've been talking about before, increase the EPA, DHA content of foods in the presence of linoleic acid versus trying to find ourselves on the front end of that inverted U shape where we're almost eliminating them altogether for the most part
Yeah,
comparatively to what we're
yeah.
seeing today. Like which
So
solution
yeah,
is easier to achieve?
yeah. So I think so I think it's hard to have substantial changes in dietary patterns once they're established in individuals or in populations for some of the reasons I talked about before. So we touched on fortification. So that's one way to bring about some changes. We did talk about some things that people who might be, let's call it, more health aware and maybe have more disposable income could achieve by playing with, more less common types of vegetable seed oils, like flaxseed, for example. Um, but the other thing that has happened, which your question sort of drives me towards, is there are now many more high oleic versions of seed oils. So, seeds have been manipulated to produce less linoleic acid
Mm,
and more oleic acid. So in the metabolic pathway, actually, you produce oleic acid and then that's converted to linoleic acid. So the plants are already producing linoleic acid, but they're metabolizing it, are producing oleic acid, but they're metabolizing it through to linoleic. So if you stop that last bit of the metabolism, the seeds will accumulate oleic acid. So you have high oleic sunflower oil, for example.
yeah,
You have
I was
some
just
other
gonna
high
mention
oleic
that.
oils. So I think um, these help. If you wanted a strategy to reduce linoleic acid intake, using those oils, as culinary oils, using them in the food production industry, etc., would be a way of reducing linoleic acid intake for sure. And that might help, so long as alpha linolenic acid was still available, that might help people make more EPA and DHA themselves at the same time as replacing linoleic with oleic acid. Now, something we didn't touch on yet, Zach, but we almost got there when we were talking about lipid peroxidation, is if you heat um, polyunsaturated fatty acid containing oils to high temperatures, you damage the fatty acids. And these damaged fatty acids are not health, not, well, they're unhealthy. They're not good for our health.